I never expected my grandfather's well would become the center of a vicious HOA battle until Margaret Wilson dumped concrete in it while I was away. But she had no idea I'd been laying a legal trap for months. What would you do if you discovered your neighbor's vendetta wasn't just about property rules but a decades-old family grudge? I still remember the day I found out I inherited Grandpa Joe's farmhouse. The lawyer handed me the yellowed envelope with shaking hands. Your grandfather was very specific about this property. He said he wanted you to have it. Inside was a hand-drawn map of 5 beautiful acres in Willow Creek Estates, including the stone well that had supplied fresh water to the farm for over 100 years. I traced my fingers over the rough paper and felt tears forming. Grandpa had shown me how to draw water from that well when I was just 8 years old. 2 months later, I moved in. The farmhouse needed work, but the land was gorgeous. The well stood proudly in the side yard, its stone circle rising from the ground like something from a fairy tale. I spent my first weekend clearing away weeds and repairing the wooden roof that sheltered it. My next-door neighbors, the Thompsons, stopped by with a basket of muffins. "We're so glad someone's living here again," Sarah Thompson said. "Your grandfather was a wonderful man." I replied, offering them water from the well. First thing I did was test the water, still pure as ever. David Thompson glanced nervously at the street. "Just so you know, the HOA has gotten stricter lately. There's a new board member who's enthusiastic about rules." I laughed. "The HOA doesn't apply to this property. Grandpa made sure of that when they formed. I have the original documents." The relief on their faces should have been my first warning. 3 days later, I was watering my vegetable garden when a shadow fell across the soil. I looked up to see a woman in an expensive-looking tracksuit standing at my fence. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and she wore oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy day. "You must be Joe's grandchild," she said without introducing herself. "I'm Margaret Wilson, HOA Board Vice President." I stood and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Nice to meet you. Your well is an eyesore," she interrupted, pointing with a manicured finger. "The HOA requires uniform landscaping. All water features need approval." I took a deep breath. "Actually, this property was established before the HOA. It's exempted from those rules." Margaret's smile tightened. "No property is exempt from maintaining community standards. I've already documented several violations." She pulled out her phone and snapped several pictures of my yard. "I have the legal document," I explained calmly. "My grandfather negotiated specific terms when the neighborhood was developed. This well is both historical and my water source. We'll see about that." She turned sharply and walked away, her expensive sneakers crunching on the gravel. That evening, a certified letter arrived. 3 violations for unapproved exterior features, non-compliant landscaping, and unsafe structures. Each carried a $100 daily fine. I called the number listed and reached Thomas Reed, the HOA president. "I understand your concern," he said hesitantly, "but Margaret is correct that we have standards. However, if you have documentation of exemption, please bring it to our next meeting." After hanging up, I dug through Grandpa's files in the old oak desk. There it was, the agreement from 1982 when developers first created Willow Creek Estates. His property was clearly listed as historically significant, with existing structures grandfathered in perpetuity. The following evening, a knock at my door revealed Julia Johnson, an elderly woman from down the street. "I saw Margaret at your fence yesterday," she said quietly. "I need to warn you about her. Last year, while Roy and I were visiting our daughter, she had our koi pond filled in, claimed it was a mosquito hazard. 20 years we had those fish." My stomach twisted. How could she do that without permission? She waits until people are away, then claims emergency action. Julia's hands trembled. "We tried to fight it, but the HOA backed her. Said we never had proper approval, even though the pond predated the HOA rules." I invited Julia in for tea, and she told me stories about other neighbors. Their garden sheds torn down, play structures demolished, traditional front gates removed. That night I couldn't sleep. I went outside with a flashlight and stood by the well, running my hand over the cool stones Grandpa had maintained so carefully. Something about Margaret's intensity frightened me. I made a decision. The next morning I called 3 people, a water rights attorney, a security company, and the State Historical Society. Your grandfather's well could qualify for protection, the Historical Society representative explained. These hand-dug wells from the early settlement period are becoming rare. We'd need to document it. The security company installed cameras, some visible, some hidden, around my property. That afternoon, the attorney, Elaine Morales, reviewed my grandfather's documents. This exemption is solid, she confirmed, but HOAs can be aggressive. Document everything, every letter, every conversation. I started a detailed log, including photos of my property each day to prove its condition. I also printed hard copies of Grandpa's exemption agreement and placed one in my car, one in my bag, and one in a waterproof container by the well itself. Over the next few weeks, Margaret led a parade of inspections past my house. More violation notices arrived. When I presented the exemption documents at the HOA meeting, Margaret claimed they needed verification from the board's attorney. Then, I had to travel for work. Before leaving, I checked all my cameras, secured the house, and asked the Thompsons to keep an eye out. Something in my gut told me trouble was coming. I had no idea just how wrong I was, or that Margaret Wilson was about to make a mistake that would give me exactly what I needed to fight back. When I returned home a week later, rain splashed against my windshield as I pulled into my driveway. My headlights swept across my front yard, then caught something strange. Where the well should have been was now a lumpy concrete plug. The carefully maintained wooden roof lay splintered nearby. I scrambled out of the car, rain soaking through my jacket. My flashlight beam revealed a nightmare. My grandfather's stone well was completely filled in with hardened concrete. A motion sensor light clicked on next door. Margaret Wilson stood on her porch in a bathrobe watching me. Even from a distance, I could see her smile. Rage boiled in my chest. "What did you do to my well?" I shouted. Margaret called back calmly. "The board voted. That dangerous hole needed to be addressed for community safety." I called the police, but they dismissed it as a civil matter. The next morning, I took the security footage to my attorney. Elaine's eyes widened. "This is far beyond HOA authority. She destroyed a historical water source, and you just received historical protection last week. That well is now officially a protected historical site." The realization dawned on me. Margaret had walked right into my legal trap. I filed a lawsuit. Neighbors came forward with evidence. The HOA panicked, and when a brick crashed through my window with a threat to drop the lawsuit, the police finally took notice. That evening, a local news van parked outside my house. I hesitated, then decided to talk. "I just want my grandfather's well restored." I told the camera it was not only my water source, but a piece of this community's history. The segment aired on the 10 o'clock news. By morning, my phone was flooded with messages from other neighborhoods sharing similar HOA horror stories. Margaret's reaction was swift. Flyers appeared on every door in the neighborhood, claiming I was trying to destroy property values with my unsightly and dangerous water hole. Some neighbors began giving me cold stares, while others called to offer support. I was retrieving my mail when Margaret approached, two large men flanking her. "You've made a serious mistake," she said quietly. "That well was never historically significant. Your grandfather knew that." "The Historical Society disagrees," I replied, trying to stay calm. "Records can be changed. Friends can be persuaded. Accidents can happen." She nodded toward my house. "I've lived here for 20 years. You've been here, what, 2 months?" One of the men stepped forward. "The HOA has hired us to conduct daily safety inspections of all properties involved in litigation. We'll need access to your home." I stood my ground. "Not without a court order." Margaret's smile turned cold. "Oh, we'll get one. And when we do, who knows what violations we'll find inside. Enough to condemn this old place, I'd bet." As they walked away, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. The men weren't wearing any official identification, and one had a tattoo identical to the handwriting on the brick note. I hurried inside and called Elaine. "Things are escalating," I explained. "I think Margaret just threatened me." "Document everything," she advised, "and stay somewhere else tonight. I'm filing for an emergency hearing tomorrow." As I packed an overnight bag, I looked out at the concrete-filled well. What had started as a neighborhood dispute had become something far more dangerous. Margaret wasn't just an entitled HOA board member. She was willing to cross lines I hadn't imagined. Why was this well so important to her? What was she really afraid of me discovering? The answer would turn out to be buried deeper than I could have imagined and would change everything about my understanding of Willow Creek Estates. My hands shook as I spread my grandfather's old papers across the kitchen table. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept working. The concrete in my well had barely dried, but my plan was already taking shape. Margaret picked the wrong person to mess with, I muttered, dialing my phone. Attorney Elaine Parker answered on the third ring. We'd met at a town hall meeting last year when I first worried about HOA troubles. She'd given me her card and some advice. Document everything. The concrete is still warm, I told her, voice cracking. But I have something Margaret doesn't know about. An hour later, Elaine sat at my table, eyes widening as I showed her my evidence. The State Historical Registry certificate I'd obtained 3 months ago after hearing about the Johnson's Koi Pond disaster, the property survey showing the well's protected status, and crystal clear security footage of Margaret directing the concrete truck onto my land. You've been preparing for this, Elaine said, impressed. Most people only react after something happens. I nodded. My grandfather taught me to think ahead. When Margaret started sending those violation notices, I knew she might try something. Elaine pointed to a paragraph in my deed. She destroyed a historically protected water feature. And look here, your deed shows riparian water rights that supersede HOA authority. What does that mean for me, I asked, hope rising for the first time since discovering the concrete. It means Margaret made a critical error, Elaine explained, excitement in her voice. She's not just liable for property damage. This constitutes criminal vandalism of a protected historical site. The fines alone could bankrupt her. I hadn't expected this level of protection. So what's our next step? We file today, Elaine said, gathering the papers, and we name both Margaret and the HOA in the lawsuit. The board members will panic when they realize their personal assets could be at risk. By sunset, the paperwork was filed. I felt a strange calm as I watered my garden, wondering if I'd need to install a modern well now. The neighborhood felt unusually quiet. Word had spread fast. My doorbell rang after dinner. Thomas Reed, the HOA president, stood on my porch looking nervous. His usual confident posture was gone. Can we talk? He asked, glancing over his shoulder. Not as HOA president, but as a neighbor who's worried. I invited him in, offering coffee, which he declined. We never authorized concrete in your well, he whispered, leaning forward. Margaret showed us different paperwork, something about a temporary covering for inspection purposes. Several board members are willing to testify she acted without approval. My heart raced. The trap was working better than I'd hoped. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Thomas sighed heavily. Because Margaret's done this before. Small things at first, forcing color changes on mailboxes, making people remove bird baths. But it's gotten worse. Last year, she had the Rodriguez family's heritage oak cut down while they were at a funeral. That's horrible, I said, genuinely shocked. The board was split on your well issue, Thomas continued, but Margaret claimed she had expert reports saying it was dangerous. Now we discover those reports don't exist. As Thomas left, promising to bring other board members forward, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you're clever with your lawsuit? This is just beginning. M. I took a screenshot, adding it to my evidence folder. Through my window, I spotted Margaret across the street, talking to my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, and pointing toward my house. Her face showed no worry, only determination. She doesn't know what's coming, I whispered to myself. The next morning, 3 more HOA board members contacted me, distancing themselves from Margaret's actions. My case was growing stronger by the hour. Elaine called with news that the judge had scheduled an emergency hearing, given the historical nature of the property damage. At dusk, I visited my well one last time before the restoration experts would arrive tomorrow to assess the damage. The concrete had set, forming a gray scar on my land. I placed my hand on it, feeling a connection to my grandfather despite the vandalism. A twig snapped behind me. Margaret stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed. Enjoying your new landscape feature? She asked, smirking. Actually, I'm about to enjoy something else, I replied calmly. Did you know this well was registered with the State Historical Society? Her smirk faltered for just a second. That doesn't matter. The HOA has authority. Not over historically protected landmarks, I said. You should check your mail. The court papers should have arrived by now. For the first time, uncertainty flashed across Margaret's face. She recovered quickly, stepping closer. You're making a big mistake, she hissed. I have friends in this town you've never even met. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you just filled in this stupid hole yourself. As she stormed off, I realized the fight was far from over. Margaret wouldn't just accept defeat, she would escalate. And somehow, deep down, I knew I was ready for it. I had been counting on exactly that. Bright yellow flyers covered every mailbox in Willow Creek Estates by 7 a.m. My jaw dropped as I read the headline, Emergency HOA Meeting. Resident threatens community values with frivolous lawsuit. Margaret had wasted no time. The flyers painted me as an enemy of neighborhood harmony, claiming my unsightly well had decreased property values by 15%. But the most shocking part was the bold lie at the bottom. Historical status falsified with forged documents. My phone buzzed constantly, neighbors calling to either support me or condemn me. By noon, the community had split into clear camps. Don't let this discourage you, Elaine advised when I called her. Margaret's panicking. These flyers actually help our case. They show malicious intent. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Returning from the grocery store, I found my front yard dotted with small signs reading, Comply or Leave. Wells kill property values. A group of Margaret's supporters, mostly newer residents who had bought into her vision of a perfectly uniform neighborhood, stood across the street watching for my reaction. Instead of removing the signs, I photographed them, adding them to my legal file. Then I calmly walked inside. That seemed to disappoint the onlookers. They had been expecting an outburst. Don't engage with them, Thomas had warned earlier. That's what Margaret wants, to provoke you into looking unreasonable. That evening, a soft knock at my back door startled me. Mrs. Jenkins, my 78-year-old neighbor, stood there looking nervous. I shouldn't be here, she whispered, but you need to know what Margaret's planning. Inside, Mrs. Jenkins explained that Margaret had held a private meeting with her closest allies. She's hired someone to check if your historical registration is backdated, Mrs. Jenkins said, and she's telling people you threatened her. Physically, I gasped. That's completely false. I know, dear. That's why I'm here. Mrs. Jenkins patted my hand. Margaret tried to make me remove my rose garden last year. Roses my late husband planted. Said they weren't on the approved plant list. I've watched her bully people for 3 years now. After she left, I went to check on my dog, Max, in the backyard. My blood ran cold. He was gone. The gate was still latched. We searched for hours, calling his name through the neighborhood, while Margaret's supporters watched silently from their porches. At midnight, my phone buzzed. A text from the Johnsons. Check Margaret's shed. We saw her dragging something there earlier. Heart pounding, I called Officer Rivera, who had taken my earlier reports. He agreed to meet me at Margaret's property. I just need to check the shed, I explained when Margaret answered her door in a bathrobe, feigning sleepiness, despite the fact that her makeup was still perfect. This is harassment, she protested as Officer Rivera explained that he had reasonable cause. When the shed door swung open, Max rushed out, dehydrated but otherwise okay. Margaret's explanation came quickly. He was digging in my yard. I was going to call animal control in the morning. Officer Rivera looked skeptical. Through a locked gate? The incident shifted neighborhood opinion dramatically. Security cameras from the Johnsons' house had caught Margaret luring Max with treats, then carrying him to her shed, footage that was now part of my growing case file. Margaret's emergency HOA meeting became her undoing. The community center buzzed with tension as neighbors from both factions filled the seats. Margaret took the podium first, presenting enlarged photos of my well, calling it dangerous and unsightly. She spoke confidently about HOA regulations and property values, occasionally glancing at me with thinly veiled contempt. Furthermore, she continued, this lawsuit threatens every homeowner here. If one person can ignore our standards, soon we'll have junk cars and chicken coops ruining our prestigious community. When my turn came, I didn't attack Margaret. Instead, I calmly displayed the historical documentation, the original property maps showing the well's significance, Photos of similar preserved features in high-value neighborhoods? This isn't about defiance, I explained. It's about preserving history while respecting community standards. My grandfather's well has provided water here for a century. Then Thomas asked for the floor. Margaret smiled, clearly expecting his support. Her smile vanished as he displayed side-by-side documents, what she had shown the board versus what she had actually ordered the concrete company to do. The board never approved filling the well with concrete, Thomas announced. These documents were altered after our signatures were added. Gas filled the room. Margaret lunged for the papers, but Thomas stepped back. The HOA is severing ties with Mrs. Wilson and fully supporting the restoration of the historical well, he continued. We've also voted to contribute to the restoration costs, as our insurance won't cover unauthorized actions. Margaret's face flushed deep red. She grabbed her purse and pushed through the crowd. This isn't over, she hissed as she passed my seat. You have no idea what's coming next. Rather than forcing conformity, my well became a registered historical landmark, a small plaque explaining its significance. On the day the restored well pumped its first clean water, neighbors gathered for an impromptu celebration, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Thomas approached me, an envelope in his hand. We found this taped behind the HOA charter, he said. It's addressed to whoever owns your property. Curious, I carefully unfolded the yellowed letter inside. The handwriting was familiar, steady, strong. My grandfather's, dated 40 years earlier. To whom it may concern, if you're reading this, someone has likely challenged the well's existence. Water brings life, but also reveals truth when it flows freely. What's buried isn't always gone. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right time to resurface. Protect what matters, not just what merely appears proper. My fingers traced the faded ink, my chest tightening with emotion. I run my hands over those words often, and especially when gathering with neighbors around the well that brought us together. Because sometimes the most valuable things we inherit aren't properties or possessions, but the courage to stand our ground when something matters, and the wisdom to know which battles are worth fighting.